Northern Wisconsin, November 1891. The first heavy snow had already buried the logging trails under 2 feet of white powder when Jacob Vinter began stacking river stones in a quiet clearing 12 miles from the nearest timber camp. The local woodsmen watched him from a distance, shaking their heads in utter disbelief. The Norwegian immigrant was building again, and this time, everyone in the territory was convinced he had completely lost his mind. "That tiny cabin will not fit a grown man's shadow," muttered Thomas Bradley, a veteran timber foreman who had survived 15 brutal winters in these northern forests. Bradley squinted through the falling snow at Jacob's foundation stakes. 12 feet by 14 feet. That was less than 168 square feet of total floor space, smaller than most root cellars in the county. Now picture this. It was not just the tiny footprint that drew ridicule from every experienced frontiersman in the valley. It was everything about the design. The thick double walls, with an empty 8-inch gap between them. The massive, excessive stonework that seemed to serve no structural purpose. The suffocating ceiling height of just 6.5 feet, which would force any tall man to stoop every time he walked across the room. Every single choice Jacob made seemed to directly contradict 2 decades of proven Wisconsin cabin building. The local loggers called it insane. They called it backwards, a complete waste of prime timber, and a guaranteed recipe for freezing to death before the spring thaw. What they did not understand, what none of them could possibly see yet, was that Jacob Vinter had brought something from the old country that no American builder in the territory possessed. It was not stubbornness. It was not ignorance. It was pure physics and engineering knowledge tested over centuries in the Scandinavian Arctic. By February, that forgotten knowledge would mean the exact difference between comfortable survival and deadly catastrophe. It would produce numbers so dramatic that seasoned frontiersmen would question their own thermometers. And it would prove once and for all that sometimes what looks like sheer madness to the untrained eye is simply engineering that is generations ahead of its time. Before we reveal precisely how Jacob constructed his shelter and why every detail worked, take a quick moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from, whether you are dealing with bitter winters right now or planning your own off-grid homestead, because by the end of this story, you will understand the exact measurements and heat retention techniques that kept one solitary hunter warm while an entire logging community froze. And that knowledge might just be more valuable than you think. The question that haunted that Wisconsin settlement still echoes today. What did this solitary Norwegian hunter understand about thermal mass and airflow that entire logging companies completely missed? The answer would rewrite the rules of wilderness survival. The winter of 1891 in the upper Midwest was shaping up to be one of the most ruthless seasons in recorded history. In the pine forests of northern Wisconsin, winter was not merely a change in the weather. It was a relentless predator. When the Arctic air masses surged down from Hudson Bay, the temperature would plummet 30 or 40 degrees in a matter of hours. The sap inside standing timber would freeze solid and expand, causing massive pine trees to explode with a sound like cannon fire in the middle of the night. In those days, survival depended entirely on your shelter and your wood pile. The standard American logging cabin was built big and built fast. Timber was practically infinite, so builders would fell straight white pines, notch the corners, and stack them up into large rectangular structures measuring 20 by 24 feet or larger. Ceilings were routinely framed 8 or 9 feet high to allow smoke to rise away from the living area. Fireplaces were constructed out of rough stone or mud-baked brick, always built directly against an exterior wall with a massive, wide-open flue running straight up into the sky. To the average frontier builder, this design made complete sense. A bigger room meant more space for bunk beds, gear, and movement. A high ceiling kept the air clear of pine smoke. And a huge, roaring fireplace on the outer wall seemed like the only way to blast enough heat into a drafty cabin. Here is the cold, hard truth that everyone missed. Those conventional cabins were thermal catastrophes. Think about that for a second. Wood is a decent insulator compared to solid rock, but standard 8-inch uninsulated log walls leak heat continuously through every single chinked seam. More importantly, hot air naturally rises. In a cabin with an 8-foot ceiling, all the warmth produced by a roaring fire immediately floats up into the top 3 feet of the room, leaving the floor level hovering barely above freezing. Even worse was the traditional exterior fireplace. When you build a stone fireplace against an outside wall with a straight vertical chimney, over 70% of the total heat produced by the burning logs escapes straight out the top of the stack into the night air. The exterior stone wall of the fireplace absorbs a massive amount of energy, but because it faces the frozen wilderness, it constantly radiates that absorbed energy directly to the outside world. It was the equivalent of pouring hot water into a bucket full of holes. During a typical northern winter, a standard frontier cabin would devour between 3/4 of a cord and a full cord of firewood every single week, just to keep the interior temperature above freezing at floor level. Loggers spent half their working hours cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking hardwood just to keep their fires fed overnight. If a man let his fire die out at 2 in the morning, he would wake up at dawn to find his water bucket frozen solid to the bottom and ice thick on the inside of his blankets. Jacob Vinter watched this endless cycle of wasted labor and miserable cold with quiet frustration. He was a man of few words, weathered by 40 years of Scandinavian winters and hard wilderness living. He had arrived in the Wisconsin woods with little more than his iron tools, a hand-drawn plan in his head, and a deep respect for natural laws. When Jacob selected his building site in early November, he purposefully chose a small clearing shielded from the north wind by a dense ridge of hemlock and granite outcrops. But it was his foundation work that first raised eyebrows among the men from the nearby logging camp. Instead of setting his corner logs on simple pier stones as every local builder did, Jacob spent 3 full weeks down in the icy bed of a stream a 1/4 mile away. He waded through freezing water, carefully inspecting and selecting individual river stones. He did not grab just any rock. He picked dense, heavy river granite, testing each piece by hand for weight and structural integrity. He rejected porous sandstone and light limestone completely. He hauled 3,200 pounds of dense river granite back to his clearing on a wooden hand sled. 2 loggers from the camp eventually walked over out of pure curiosity and offered to help him haul what they assumed were foundation rocks for a large home. But when they saw the tiny outline of his foundation stakes, 12 feet by 14 feet, they stopped in their tracks. "You are moving over 1.5 tons of rock for a cabin no bigger than a woodshed?" one logger asked, shaking his head. Jacob did not stop working. "Stone holds heat," he replied in his quiet, broken English. "For a very long time." The loggers laughed and walked back to camp, spreading the word that the Norwegian hunter was spending his days hauling rocks to build a stone coffin. "Stay with me here," because what happened next went against every rule of frontier construction. Jacob dug a continuous foundation trench 2 feet deep around the perimeter of his cabin stakes. But he did not stop at the outer boundary. He excavated the trench 18 inches inward, extending the stone base deep beneath the area where his interior floor would sit. He painstakingly laid 280 individual granite river stones into this trench, setting them in a thick mortar of local clay, sand, and wood ash. He fitted them together so precisely that a man could not slide a knife blade between the joints. When the stone base was level and complete, Jacob did not lay wooden floorboards over joists with an air space underneath, as American builders always did. Instead, he poured an earthen floor composed of packed clay, pulverized river stone, and fine sand directly on top of the granite foundation. The interior floor was in direct, continuous thermal contact with 3,200 pounds of solid granite buried in the ground. Every builder in the county warned him he was making a fatal error. Thomas Bradley came by 3 days before Thanksgiving and saw Jacob leveling the damp clay floor with a wooden tamper. "That stone is going to suck the heat right out of your boots," Bradley warned, resting his hands on his hips. "Cold ground creates a cold floor. Everyone knows you need an air gap under your planks to keep the frost away. Every American builder knows that," Jacob said quietly, continuing his work without looking up. The correction stung Bradley's pride. Bradley had built 17 cabins across Wisconsin and Michigan. He had survived record freezes that killed lesser men. And here was this quiet immigrant, suggesting that 2 decades of American frontier experience were somehow inferior to European methods. By the first week of December, the walls of Jacob's cabin began to rise, and the entire logging camp found excuses to drop by and gawking at the bizarre construction. Instead of stacking a single layer of massive pine logs, Jacob was building double walls. He constructed an inner wall using straight pine logs 8 inches in diameter, notched carefully at the corners and chinked with a dense mixture of damp clay, moss, and dry pine needles. That was normal enough. But 8 inches outward from that inner wall, he erected a second, parallel outer wall using the exact same log dimensions and chinking. This created an 8-inch hollow airspace, completely encircling the inner cabin. That gap is just going to fill up with wild mice and rot your timbers out in 3 years, Bradley told him during another visit. You are wasting double the lumber and cutting your living space down to nothing. Air does not rot wood if it is trapped, Jacob replied, carefully applying clay mortar to the outer wall seams with his bare hands, despite the freezing cold. Moving air steals heat. Trapped air guards heat. Jacob was building what modern building scientists call a double-wall thermal envelope. The outer log wall took the brunt of the howling winter winds and snow loads. The 8-inch dead air space between the two walls acted as a massive insulation barrier, completely eliminating convective heat loss through the cabin sides. Because the air inside the gap was isolated from the blowing winds outside, it created a stable, non-moving thermal cushion. Next came the ceiling and the roof, which brought even more ridicule from the onlookers. Jacob set his ceiling joists at precisely 6 feet 6 inches from the clay floor. A tall man like Thomas Bradley, who stood 6 feet 2 inches in his boots, could barely walk inside without his hat brushing the wooden beams. Above these heavy joists, Jacob laid thick pine planks, followed by a double layer of birch bark for waterproofing. Then, he did something that made the local loggers convinced he had completely lost his sanity. He hauled cut sod from the meadow edge and piled nearly 2 feet of rich dirt and dense grass directly onto the roof structure. The weight was so immense that Jacob had to double the thickness of his roof rafters to prevent a structural collapse. He is building an underground burrow on top of a wooden frame. One logger joked at the camp mess hall. He is going to crush himself in his sleep. They called it heating the sky. They said the sod would trap rain, rot the roof, and freeze into a solid block of ice that would radiate pure cold downward into his bed. What they failed to realize was that 2 feet of dry sod and earth provided an insulation value equivalent to modern high-performance roof insulation. Heat naturally rises, but when it hit Jacob's low 6.5-foot ceiling, it encountered a virtually impenetrable barrier of birch bark, timber, and 2 feet of dense earth. There was nowhere for the thermal energy to go, except to stay right inside the small room. By reducing the total room volume to just under 1,100 cubic feet, compared to the 6,000 cubic feet of a standard logging cabin, Jacob had cut the amount of air he needed to heat by over 80%. Every single cubic foot of space in his shelter was compact, contained, and heavily insulated on all 6 sides. However, the absolute crowning piece of Jacob's supposed mad design was his fireplace. In every conventional American cabin, the fireplace was located in the center of an exterior wall, built large enough to swallow 3-foot logs whole. Jacob did the exact opposite. He constructed his fireplace not on an outer wall, but deep inside the cabin in an interior corner. Furthermore, the firebox itself was astonishingly small. The opening was barely 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep, hardly large enough to burn 2 modest oak logs at the same time. But the positioning and construction of the masonry were unlike anything the frontiersman had ever seen. Jacob angled the firebox at precisely 45 degrees relative to the room's central axis. He built the back and sides of the firebox using solid river granite 3 layers thick, completely enclosing the fire in heavy stone on 5 sides. Crucially, the stone base of the fireplace was integrated directly into the 3,200-pound granite foundation beneath the floor. And instead of sending the chimney flue straight up through the roof directly above the firebox, Jacob built a slanted, stepped stone flue that traveled horizontally through the interior space for 3 feet before turning upward and exiting through the sod roof. "You are going to smoke yourself to death," Bradley predicted, shaking his head as he inspected the masonry work. "Chimneys have to go straight up through an outside wall. That is how you get a proper draft. If you bend the flue inside the room, you will fill your cabin with carbon monoxide and suffocation." Jacob tamped the final layer of damp clay around the flue stones and looked Bradley straight in the eye. "Draft works with heat difference," Jacob explained calmly. "Heat rises when it is hot. This chimney will give its heat to the room before the air escapes into the forest." "That is not how any of this works," Bradley snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "You have built a cramped, over-insulated, stone-heavy box with a tiny stove that will backdraft smoke right into your lungs. You are going to freeze or suffocate, probably both, and we are going to find your frozen corpse come the spring thaw." Jacob stood up and brushed the wet clay from his calloused hands. He was half a foot shorter than Bradley, his face lined with the hard experience of a life spent in harsh environments. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the timber foreman with a quiet, undeniable certainty. "We will see," Jacob said. On December 11th, 1891, Jacob Vinter officially moved into his completed shelter. That night, the loggers at the timber camp began taking cash bets on how many days the Norwegian hunter would last before crawling back to their bunkhouse to beg for shelter. Some bet 3 days, some bet a week. Not a single man in camp bet that he would make it past New Year's Day. They were completely convinced they would be digging his grave in the frozen ground before January was over. What Thomas Bradley and the loggers could not see, what they had walked past dozens of times without understanding, was that Jacob had not built a cabin at all. He had built a heat battery. Here's what everyone missed about the physics of Jacob's masonry work. The heavy river granite Jacob had laboriously gathered from the riverbed possessed a high thermal density. Solid granite has a heat capacity that allows it to absorb enormous amounts of thermal energy without cracking or deteriorating. When you surround a fire with thousands of pounds of dense stone, the radiant heat from the flames does not simply pass through the walls and dissipate into the outside air. The stone slowly absorbs that energy, soaking it up like a massive thermal sponge. Because Jacob had connected the interior firebox directly to the continuous stone foundation extending under the floor, every single fire he lit did not just warm the air in the room. It pumped heat directly into 3,200 pounds of granite beneath his feet. The 45-degree angle of the firebox was equally deliberate. In a square room, a fire built against a flat wall radiates heat directly at the opposite wall, creating severe cold spots in the corners. By angling the firebox into the corner, Jacob allowed the radiant thermal waves to bounce evenly across all interior surfaces, maximizing the absorption of heat into the double walls and the earthen floor. Furthermore, his interior chimney flue was a masterclass in ancient European heating engineering. In traditional Scandinavian masonry heaters, known in Norway as at times pisoven, exhaust gases from a fire are forced to travel through a long, winding path of heavy stone channels before exiting the building. As the superheated exhaust smoke passes through these interior masonry channels, it transfers almost all of its thermal energy into the surrounding stone. By the time the smoke finally exits the roof, it is cool, having left its heat behind inside the living space. Jacob's 3-foot interior stone flue operated on this exact principle. Instead of allowing 800-degree exhaust gas to shoot straight out into the sky, his stepped stone flue absorbed that intense thermal energy and radiated it back into the cabin. The chimney itself became a massive, radiant heating element standing right inside the room. On December 15th, 4 days after moving in, Jacob conducted his first full system test. He built a hot, fast-burning fire using split-seasoned oak. He fed the small firebox steadily for 3 hours, letting the flames roar hot and clean. Within 90 minutes, the river granite surrounding the firebox grew warm to the touch. By the 3rd hour, the stone was hot enough that a man could not comfortably rest a bare hand against it for more than a few seconds. More remarkably, the earthen clay floor near the fireplace began to transform. The cold dampness vanished, replaced by a deep, pleasant warmth that spread outward from the hearth in concentric circles. At 6 o'clock that evening, Jacob stopped adding wood and allowed the fire to die out completely. By 7 o'clock, the last glowing embers in the firebox had turned to cold gray ash. Jacob pulled out his father's old silver pocket watch and began recording the results in a small leather-bound journal, writing meticulously in Norwegian. At 10 o'clock that night, 4 hours after the fire had completely died, the earthen floor near the hearth was still radiating a steady, comfortable warmth. Jacob sat on his wooden bench without his heavy wool coat, completely comfortable in his shirt sleeves. At 2 o'clock in the morning, with the outside temperature dropping to 6 degrees above zero, the air inside the tiny cabin remained extraordinarily stable. The stone foundation beneath the floor was slowly, steadily releasing its stored thermal energy back upward into the room. At 8 o'clock the next morning, 14 full hours after the last log had burned to ash, Jacob woke up. He stepped out of his narrow bed and walked across the room barefoot. The clay floor was still noticeably warm beneath his bare feet. He checked his wall thermometer. The interior air temperature read 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He had burned just 4 small pieces of oak 19 hours prior. In his journal, Jacob noted the exact timing and temperatures. The physical principle had held true. Stone had remembered the fire. The thermal mass had absorbed the intense, short-duration heat of a clean burn and was now releasing it gradually over a 16-hour decay cycle. While the loggers in the timber camp were waking up every 2 hours to stoke their glowing iron stoves with endless cords of pine, Jacob was sleeping peacefully through the night on a single burn. The stage was now set for the ultimate test. A mild December was about to give way to one of the most violent Arctic blizzards the upper Midwest had ever seen. Nature was about to put Jacob's ancient engineering to a test that would leave no room for debate. On December 20th, 1891, curiosity finally got the better of Thomas Bradley. The winter winds were picking up, and the temperature outside had hovered around 10 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 straight days. Bradley decided to walk the 12-minute trail through the snow to Jacob's clearing, half expecting to find the Norwegian huddled over a failing fire, shivering and regretting his stubbornness. When Bradley arrived at the clearing, smoke was rising from the small stone chimney. It was not the thick, black, desperate smoke of an overstoked stove, but a thin, steady gray plume. Bradley knocked on the thick pine door. After a short pause, the heavy wooden latch lifted, and the door swung open. Jacob Vinter stood in the doorway dressed in plain trousers and a light linen shirt with his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was not wearing his heavy wool coat. He was not wearing boots. He looked like a man standing on his porch in the middle of May. "Come inside," Jacob said, stepping back to make room. Bradley had to stoop his head significantly to pass through the low doorway. Once inside, he straightened up, and the top of his skull immediately brushed against the heavy roof joists. 6.5 feet of vertical clearance felt incredibly cramped to a man who stood over 6 feet tall. "You have trapped yourself in a badger burrow," Bradley said, though his voice lacked the sharp confidence it had carried 3 weeks earlier. Because despite the claustrophobic ceiling and the tiny 12 by 14 footprint, the interior of the cabin was unmistakably, profoundly warm. A tiny fire flickered in the corner fireplace, barely 2 small oak logs burning steadily, yet the entire room felt as cozy as a sunlit parlor. Bradley found himself unbuttoning his heavy fleece-lined jacket within 30 seconds of stepping inside. Jacob sat down on a simple hand-carved wooden stool near his small dining table, which occupied much of the cabin's central floor space. "How much wood did you burn last night?" Bradley asked, looking around the room in utter disbelief. Bradley considered his own living situation. He shared a large 20 by 24-foot cabin with 2 other loggers. Their shelter featured an 8-foot ceiling and a massive stone fireplace built into the north wall. To keep that room anywhere above freezing overnight, the 3 men had to split and burn through nearly half a cord of dry pine every single 24 hours. Even then, the corners of their cabin were coated in thick white frost, and their water bucket froze solid every night. Jacob held his hands about 18 inches apart. "I burned 2 logs of seasoned oak for 3 hours yesterday evening," he said calmly. "Then I let the fire die out completely before I went to sleep." "That is impossible," Bradley snapped, shaking his head. You would freeze to death in 4 hours without a standing fire in this cold. Touch the floor, Jacob said simply. Bradley hesitated, then knelt down and placed his bare palm flat against the earthen clay surface near the center of the room. The floor was warm. It was not burning hot, but it was distinctly, undeniably warmer than any cabin floor Bradley had ever felt in his 15 years on the frontier. He slid his hand toward the outer wall. The temperature dropped slightly near the double timber walls, but even in the furthest corner, the clay floor remained dry and comfortably mild. "It is the granite underneath," Jacob explained, gesturing downward. "It drinks heat when the fire burns hot. Then it releases that heat slowly back into the air all night long. The entire floor becomes a stove the size of the room." Bradley stood up and brushed the clay dust from his trousers. His mind, trained through years of practical timber construction and structural framing, began frantically processing what he was witnessing. The physical logic was unassailable, even if it contradicted everything he had ever been taught. By building a cabin with only 168 square feet of floor space and a 6.5-foot ceiling, Jacob had restricted the total air volume to roughly 1,100 cubic feet. Bradley's shared cabin held nearly 6,000 cubic feet of air, nearly 6 times as much space that required constant heating. By piling 2 feet of sod on the roof, Jacob had completely sealed the top of the room where heat naturally accumulated. By building double timber walls with an 8-inch dead air gap, he had created an insulating wall system that prevented heat from escaping sideways into the frozen woods. And by burying 3,200 pounds of dense river granite directly beneath an earthen floor, he had created a massive thermal flywheel that smoothed out the extreme temperature swings of the winter climate. "It is still too small," Bradley argued, though his tone sounded weak even to his own ears. "A grown man needs room to stretch out. You cannot live crammed into a tiny box like a fox in a den." Jacob looked around his immaculate home. A narrow bed was tucked neatly along one wall. A sturdy table, 2 stools, a dry pantry shelf, and a corner rack for his hunting rifle and steel traps completed the interior. Everything a solitary woodsman required was organized with meticulous Scandinavian efficiency. "Americans build big because you have endless timber to cut," Jacob said softly. "In Norway, wood is precious, and timber is scarce. We learned centuries ago to build small, hold the heat, and stay warm with very little fuel. Americans build giant cabins and burn whole forests just to heat air that leaks out through the roof." The mathematics were painful for Bradley to accept. His cabin consumed 6 times more firewood while delivering less than half the actual comfort. "What happens when the real winter hits?" Bradley asked, leaning against the warm stone chimney stack. "What happens when the mercury drops to 20 below zero? 30 below zero? This clever little stone trick might work in mild December weather, but January and February will force you to face reality." Jacob picked up a small wooden wedge and fed it into the quiet hearth. The chimney draft drew the faint smoke upward effortlessly, radiating warmth through the interior stone stack. "Then we will see," Jacob said. Here's what everyone missed about the pure physics behind Jacob Vinter's design. To understand why his tiny shelter performed so miraculously when the deep cold arrived, you have to look at the 3 fundamental ways heat travels: conduction, convection, and radiation. In a traditional frontier log cabin, all 3 heat transfer mechanisms work relentlessly against the inhabitant. Conduction occurs when heat passes directly through solid materials. Single-layer log walls, no matter how thick, slowly conduct heat from the warm interior wood to the freezing exterior wood exposed to the sub-zero air. Convection occurs through the movement of fluids and gases. Cold air is dense and heavy, so it settles near the floor. Warm air is light, so it rapidly rises toward high ceilings. In a standard cabin with an 8-foot ceiling, a powerful convective loop is created. The fire heats the air, which instantly shoots to the ceiling. As it touches the cold, poorly insulated roof boards, it cools down, grows heavy, and falls back down along the freezing exterior walls, creating a constant, icy draft across the floor, where people sit and sleep. Furthermore, traditional fireplaces created a devastating convective penalty known as stack effect. A large, open exterior fireplace requires a massive amount of oxygen to keep its fire burning. To feed that roaring fire, the chimney draws huge volumes of air out of the room and blasts it up the stack. That air has to be replaced. As a result, the fireplace actively sucks freezing outside air in through every tiny crack, seam, and keyhole in the cabin walls. The bigger you build the fire, the faster it pulls -20-degree air into your living room. Jacob Vinter's design completely dismantled all three of these heat loss mechanisms. First, his double-wall log construction effectively destroyed conductive and convective wall losses. By placing two distinct log walls 8 inches apart and sealing both layers with clay chinking, he created a dead air gap. Air is an exceptionally poor conductor of heat when it is trapped and prevented from moving. The 8-inch gap acted as a thermal buffer zone. The outer log wall endured the freezing wind, while the inner log wall remained close to room temperature. Convective loops within the walls were completely eliminated because the air could not circulate. Second, his low ceiling height and 2-foot sod roof cured the ceiling convective loop. By dropping the ceiling to 6.5 feet, Jacob reduced the vertical distance warm air could travel. There was no vast empty overhead space for thermal energy to hide. The heavy layer of sod provided immense thermal resistance, meaning the warm air hovering at ceiling level lost almost no energy to the sky. Third, his internal angled masonry hearth eliminated the destructive stack effect while maximizing radiant heat transfer. Radiant heat travels in invisible electromagnetic waves, warming solid objects directly without needing to heat the intervening air first. Sunbeams, warming a dark stone on a cold winter day, operate on radiant heat. By enclosing his tiny firebox on 5 sides with 3,200 pounds of river granite, Jacob captured almost all the high-intensity radiant energy produced by the burning oak logs. The dense granite absorbed those radiant waves at a microscopic level, causing the molecules within the rock to vibrate and store energy. Because granite has a high volumetric heat capacity, it can hold roughly 1,600 British thermal units of energy per cubic foot for every 100-degree rise in temperature. When Jacob burned a hot, fast fire for 3 hours, he raised the internal temperature of his 3,000-pound granite base by several hundred degrees. That translated into tens of thousands of stored British thermal units of energy locked beneath his clay floor. When the fire died out and the chimney damper was closed to prevent warm air from escaping up the flue, that locked energy had only one place to go. It began to conduct slowly upward through the earthen clay floor and radiate directly into the room. Because the radiant energy was coming from the floor beneath his feet, it reversed the entire atmospheric profile of the cabin. The floor was the warmest surface in the room, not the ceiling. The air near his bed remained comfortably warm because the very ground he walked on was acting as a massive, low-temperature radiant heater. While his neighbors were burning cords of wood to fight cold air falling from their ceilings, Jacob was resting on top of a solid granite heat battery that released its stored energy at a steady, predictable rate of 5,000 to 8,000 thermal units per hour for up to 16 straight hours. On January 7, 1892, the true Arctic terror arrived in northern Wisconsin. It did not come with a roaring wind or a dramatic snowstorm at first. It arrived under a crystalline, pale blue sky and an eerie, absolute stillness. This was the dreaded Siberian high, a massive, dense polar air pressure system that slid down from the Canadian Arctic and settled over the Great Lakes region like a blanket of liquid nitrogen. By the evening of January 8th, all moisture in the atmosphere had frozen out into microscopic floating ice needles that glinted in the sunlight. When a man breathed out, his breath froze instantly with a quiet, crackling hiss. Every step taken on the hard-packed snow sounded like crunching glass. The camp thermometer at the main logging headquarters registered 18 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at noon on January 9th. By nightfall, the mercury had plunged to 23 degrees below 0. The timber camp boss, an experienced Swedish woodsman named Larsson, who had spent 30 years in the northern wilderness, officially suspended all logging operations. "No man goes into the timber until this cold snap breaks," Larsson announced to the assembled crew in the mess hall. "Tools shatter like glass in this frost, and horses drop with frozen lungs in 20 minutes. Any man who thinks he can fight this weather dies stupid. The entire settlement transformed into a battleground for basic survival. In the main bunkhouse, 16 loggers huddled around a massive cast-iron stove that was kept glowing red-hot from continuous stoking. Despite the roaring iron stove, the corners of the bunkhouse dropped to 10 degrees above zero. The men pulled their bunk mattresses right up to the stove, sleeping in their heavy wool boots, parkas, and fur caps, taking turns every 45 minutes to throw more split hardwood into the iron belly. In the smaller private cabins scattered around the timber claim, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Families and logging partners watched their dry firewood piles shrink at an alarming rate. Thomas Bradley and his 2 cabin mates were burning through nearly 3/4 of a cord of split hardwood every 24 hours just to keep their living space at 12 degrees above zero Fahrenheit. The frost on their interior walls grew to 3 inches thick, sealing their small glass windows in solid ice. Water buckets brought inside from the well froze solid within 60 minutes of being placed 5 feet from the fireplace hearth. On the morning of January 10th, the thermometer at headquarters registered 27 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. "We need to check on Jacob Vinter," said Caleb, a young logger who shared Bradley's cabin. Caleb was shivering violently despite wearing 3 layers of wool shirts and 2 pairs of thick trousers. He was huddled so close to their massive fireplace that his pant legs were scorching, yet his back was freezing cold from the draft pulling through the rear log wall. "That tiny toy burrow of his cannot possibly hold up to a freeze like this," Caleb insisted. "He has no real fireplace and no large wood pile. He is probably frozen solid in his bed right now." Bradley stared into the roaring flames of their fireplace, watching valuable split oak turn to ash in minutes while delivering almost no relief. Their wood stack outside was already more than half gone, and hauling fresh logs through 30 below zero cold was a suicide mission. Exposed skin would freeze solid in less than 3 minutes under those conditions. "If he is alive, he will not leave his cabin to answer a knock," Bradley said, his voice grim. "And if he is dead, the frost will keep him until the spring thaw comes." But Bradley could not get the Norwegian out of his mind. He remembered the calm, unshakable confidence in Jacob's eyes. He remembered the feeling of that warm clay floor beneath his bare palm in December. He remembered the math. On the morning of January 11th, 1892, the polar air mass reached its absolute peak. The camp thermometer read 31 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. When factoring in the light 5-mile-per-hour breeze creeping through the hemlocks, the wind chill equivalent plunged past 45 degrees below zero. Curiosity, mixed with a deep sense of dread and professional pride, finally broke Bradley's resolve. "I am going to the Norwegian's clearing," Bradley announced. He wrapped his face in 3 layers of dry wool scarfs, pulled his heavy beaver fur cap down over his ears, pulled heavy mitts over his leather gloves, and stepped out into the killing frost. The 12-minute walk through the forest was a terrifying experience. The cold was an active physical force, pressing against his chest and making it difficult to expand his lungs. The trees around him groaned and cracked like rifle shots as the moisture inside their trunks froze solid. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. When Bradley finally rounded the bend into Jacob's clearing, he stopped and stared through his frost-crusted eyelashes. A thin, barely visible stream of light gray smoke was rising steadily from the short stone chimney poking out of the sod roof. The sod roof itself was covered in a pristine, undisturbed 3-foot blanket of fluffy white snow. Bradley blinked in shock. On every other cabin in the valley, the heat escaping through the poorly insulated roofs had melted the snow directly above the living spaces, creating massive icicles hanging from the eaves and clear bare spots on the wooden shingles. But on Jacob's cabin, the snow layer remained completely frozen and intact. Not a single BTU of heat was escaping through that 2-foot layer of earth and sod. Bradley trudged across the clearing and hammered his heavy mitten against the thick timber door. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Bradley felt a sudden lump forming in his throat, fearing the worst. Then, he heard the heavy wooden latch lift from the inside. The timber door swung open, and Thomas Bradley received the greatest shock of his life. Jacob Vinter stood in the doorway, framed by the warm glow of his interior hearth. He was wearing an unbuttoned flannel shirt over a lightweight linen undershirt, his collar open at the throat. His sleeves were pushed up past his elbows, and his forehead was slightly slick with perspiration. He was holding a wooden spoon in one hand and a pewter bowl in the other. "Come in, quickly," Jacob said, stepping aside and motioning Bradley inside. "The wind is cold." Bradley practically fell across the threshold, his legs trembling from the exertion and the piercing cold. Jacob closed the heavy timber door behind him and dropped the wooden latch into place. The sudden transition in temperature was so violent that Bradley felt dizzy. The frost crusting his eyebrows, mustache, and eyelashes began melting instantly, sending streams of warm water dripping down his weathered cheeks. He pulled his wool face scarf down with frozen mitts and stared around the room, completely speechless. The cabin was not just survival warm. It was genuinely, luxuriously comfortable. "How?" Bradley choked out, his vocal cords stiff from disuse and cold air. "How is this possible?" Jacob gestured toward the corner fireplace. A modest fire was crackling quietly in the angled firebox. It contained just 2 split logs of dry oak, neither of them larger than a man's forearm. It was the kind of modest fire a camper might build on a cool autumn evening in September, not the desperate inferno required during a 30 below zero polar freeze. "I burned hot yesterday afternoon for 4 hours," Jacob explained softly. "Oak and hard maple. A very hot burn. The granite foundation drank the heat. Now, the stone gives it back to me." Bradley pulled off his heavy outer mittens with shaking hands. His hands were shaking from pure shock, not cold. He knelt down right in the middle of the small cabin and placed his bare palm flat against the clay floor. The surface was warm. It was remarkably warm, carrying the temperature of river rock sitting under a hot July sun. Bradley slid his hand across the earthen floor toward the far corner near his narrow bed. Even there, 6 feet away from the hearth, the ground radiated a steady, comfortable heat. He stood up, looked at the low 6.5-foot ceiling, then touched the inner log wall. The wood felt dry and completely warm to the touch. There was not a single grain of frost anywhere inside the cabin. "This is impossible," Bradley whispered, shaking his head in total disbelief. "It defies everything I know about timber framing." "It is Norwegian," Jacob replied simply, as though that single word explained all the laws of thermodynamics. Bradley stepped into the middle of the room, closed his eyes, and simply stood there, allowing the deep, radiant heat to penetrate through his heavy wool clothing. The air temperature inside the cabin felt like at least 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in. Outside, the temperature was 31 degrees below zero. Inside, without a roaring fire, the cabin maintained a stable 45 degrees above zero. That was a temperature difference of 76 degrees Fahrenheit across a simple log wall. And Jacob was maintaining that staggering thermal gradient using less firewood than Bradley used to boil a pot of coffee in the morning. "How much wood have you burned since this freeze started 4 days ago?" Bradley asked, looking at the tiny pile of neat oak logs stacked beside the hearth. Jacob thought for a moment, calculating in his head. "Maybe 1/4 of a cord," he replied. "Mostly during my 4-hour hot burns each afternoon. I let the fire die at 8 in the evening, and the stone works through the entire night while I sleep under one wool blanket." Bradley felt a knot form in his stomach. In his own shared cabin, he and his 2 mates had consumed nearly 2 full cords of prime hardwood over the exact same 4-day period. They had worked in shifts through the night, stoking an iron monster that roared and sputtered, yet they had been shivering, miserable, and frostbitten every single second. The numbers do not lie. Jacob was consuming 1/8 the firewood, achieving 4 times the interior warmth, and sleeping peacefully through the night without stoking a single ember. "The logging camp needs to know about this," Bradley said, looking at Jacob with a newfound sense of awe. "We have families with small children in the valley who are running out of wood. They are burning their wooden fences and spare furniture just to keep their toddlers from freezing. If this design works in 30 below zero, it can save lives." "It works because it obeys the stone," Jacob said gently. "You cannot force heat into air that wants to escape. You must invite heat into stone that wants to keep it." Outside, the polar wind began to moan through the tops of the white pines. The atmospheric pressure was dropping, signaling that the extreme cold would hold its grip on northern Wisconsin for several more days. In cabins across the timber claim, men would spend another terrifying night huddled around drafty fireplaces, watching their precious wood piles vanish while frost crept across their floors. But inside this small 12 by 14-foot timber box that everyone had mocked as a madman's burrow, Jacob Vinter would sleep in absolute comfort, wrapped in a single wool blanket, sustained by 3,200 pounds of river granite that held the memory of fire long after the flames had died. By the morning of January 12, 1892, news of Jacob Vinter's cabin had spread through the frozen settlement like wildfire through dry pine needles. Thomas Bradley had returned from his excursion half frozen on the outside, but burning with absolute conviction on the inside. He walked straight into the headquarters office and confronted Larson, the camp boss, along with Friedrich, a master German timber builder, and several senior loggers. "You all called him crazy," Bradley declared, pulling off his frozen cap. "I called him crazy. But I stood in his cabin while the thermometer outside read 31 below zero. He had 2 small sticks of oak in his hearth, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, and his floor was as warm as a summer rock. He is using a fraction of the wood we burn, and his room is 40 degrees warmer than ours." Larson squinted through the pipe smoke hovering in his office. "You are telling me a Norwegian hunter built a 12 by 14 box that stays 40 degrees without a fire?" "Come see for yourself," Bradley said flatly. "Bring the Chicago brass thermometer. Bring Friedrich. If I am lying, you can cut my wages for a month." At 2 o'clock that afternoon, a group of 8 men trudged through the deep snow to Jacob's clearing. The group included Larson, Friedrich, Bradley, young Caleb, and 4 experienced loggers. One of the men carried the official timber company thermometer, a precision brass instrument imported from a commercial supply house in Chicago. The air outside was brutal. The brass thermometer read 29 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, with a light wind creating an effective chill of minus 35 degrees. The men stood in the clearing, their faces covered in thick wool wraps, ice forming thick on their beards within minutes. "Look at his woodpile," Bradley said, pointing to a small, neat stack of split oak near Jacob's door. "I counted those logs yesterday. He has burned 7 small pieces of oak in the last 18 hours. Larson shook his head in deep skepticism. "I burned 20 times that amount in my cabin, and my tea freezes in the cup while I am drinking it." Bradley stepped forward and knocked hard on the heavy door. Jacob opened it immediately. He stood before them in his plain flannel shirt, his collar unbuttoned, looking completely relaxed. "Gentlemen," Jacob said in his quiet, accented voice, "please, step inside out of the frost." The 8 men filed into the tiny cabin, crowding the small central space between the table and the bed. The last man to enter pulled the heavy timber door shut and dropped the latch. The impact of the warmth hit them like a solid physical barrier. Young Caleb actually gasped, pulling down his face scarf as sweat instantly broke out on his forehead. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed, looking around the room in absolute bewilderment. "It is like stepping into summer." "No blasphemy needed," Jacob said with a subtle smile. "Only stone, wood, and simple physics." The man holding the Chicago brass thermometer held the instrument up in the center of the room at chest level, waiting for the red mercury line to stabilize. The entire room fell completely silent, save for the faint, soft crackle of 2 small oak logs burning slowly in the corner hearth. The 8 frontiersmen watched the mercury line creep steadily upward. It passed 10 degrees above zero. It passed 20 degrees. It passed 30 degrees. Finally, the mercury settled and held perfectly still. 41 degrees Fahrenheit, the thermometer operator announced, his voice trembling with disbelief. 41 degrees above zero. Larson pulled off his heavy beaver cap and ran a hand over his balding head. "That is a 70-degree difference from the air outside," he muttered, doing the mental math in his head. 70 degrees in a room with a hearth, no bigger than a bucket. That tiny fire would not heat a chicken coop in this frost. "The fire is only the ignition," Jacob explained calmly. He knelt down on the clay floor near the hearth and patted the ground with both palms. "Touch this floor." One by one, the grizzled woodsmen knelt down and pressed their bare hands against the packed earthen floor. Their reactions ranged from shock to pure astonishment. The ground was distinctly, deeply warm, radiating a persistent thermal energy that warmed their legs and torsos from below. "It is 3,200 pounds of dense river granite," Bradley explained to the group, pulling out a small notebook where he had drawn Jacob's structural framing plans. "The stone foundation extends 2 feet deep and 18 inches inside the cabin perimeter. The firebox is completely enclosed in stone on 5 sides. When Jacob burns a hot fire for 3 or 4 hours, the granite absorbs tens of thousands of thermal units. Then, it slowly radiates that energy back upward through this earthen floor for 16 to 20 hours after the fire is dead." "Thermal mass," Friedrich whispered, his eyes wide with sudden realization. Friedrich was a German immigrant who had learned timber framing in the Black Forest before coming to America. "My grandfather built homes with it in Bavaria. Kachelofen, massive masonry tile stoves that held heat for a full day on a single armload of wood. It works on the exact same thermodynamic principle." Jacob nodded respectfully to the older German builder. "In Norway, we call it a pisoven," Jacob said. "The name changes, but the stone remains the same. Stone remembers the fire. You Americans build huge fireplaces against exterior walls and burn whole forests, letting 80% of your heat escape up the chimney. We burn a very hot, clean fire for a short time, store the energy in heavy stone, and let the stone warm the home all night long." Larson knelt down near the hearth, examining the interior masonry and the stepped stone chimney stack. "Your chimney does not go straight out through the wall," Larson noted. "It rises 3 feet through the interior space first. Every degree of heat that travels up that stone flue warms the chimney mass inside the room before the smoke exits through the roof," Jacob said. "The chimney itself acts as a second heater." "And the ceiling height," Friedrich added, looking up at the 6.5-foot wooden joists. "It is not too low. It is mathematically precise. You have eliminated 4,000 cubic feet of useless overhead airspace that would otherwise collect wasted heat. Combined with the double timber walls and the 2-foot sod roof, you have created a near-perfect thermal envelope." The demonstration continued for nearly an hour. Jacob answered every technical question with patient, quiet precision. He showed them how he selected dense river granite instead of porous limestone. He explained why hardwood, like oak and maple, worked better for charging the stone battery than soft pine. He demonstrated how the angled 45-degree hearth distributed radiant heat across the entire room without creating cold dead zones. And that's when everything changed for the entire settlement. The raw numbers presented an undeniable truth that no experienced builder could argue against. Jacob's cabin held a steady 41 degrees inside, burned 1/4 of a cord of wood over 3 days, and contained 168 square feet of living space. The standard logging cabins hovered at 9 degrees above zero inside, consumed nearly 2 full cords of wood over the same 3 days, and held 480 square feet of cold, drafty space. Jacob was maintaining an interior temperature 32 degrees higher than his neighbors, while consuming 1/8 the firewood in a footprint 1/3 the size. The efficiency was not merely 10 or 20% better. It was an 8-fold improvement in thermal performance during the worst weather conditions of the 19th century. Larson stood up, his face serious and resolute. He looked at Friedrich, then at Bradley, and finally at Jacob. "This polar cold is going to last at least another 3 or 4 days," Larson said. "Half the families in this valley are out of firewood and burning their barn planks to survive. We have mothers with infants who will not make it if another freeze hits us next month." He looked directly at Jacob. "Can this design be replicated quickly? Can we build these thermal mass cabins for our families before the next blizzard hits?" "Converting an existing large cabin is difficult," Jacob admitted, honest. "The granite foundation must be laid deep beneath the floor before the walls go up. But building a new compact shelter? Yes. If you have stone, clay, timber, and 4 hard-working men, you can erect one in 6 days. The timber camp has unlimited men and unlimited timber," Larson declared, and we have families who need survival homes right now. Larson turned to his top builders. Bradley, Friedrich, you will work directly under Jacob's instruction. Tomorrow morning, we clear snow and start laying stone foundations for 2 new compact cabins. The first one goes to the Halverson family. They have 3 small children, huddled in a drafty cabin, with no firewood left. We start tomorrow at dawn. As the men filed out of Jacob's warm cabin and stepped back into the howling 29 below zero air, Thomas Bradley lingered behind near the doorway. They called you a madman, Jacob, Bradley said quietly, looking at the Norwegian hunter with profound respect. Jacob smiled a rare, gentle expression that softened his weathered face. They called me Norwegian, Jacob replied softly. In America, sometimes people think those 2 words mean the exact same thing. Not anymore, Bradley said, extending his thick glove hand. Not after today. Jacob shook his hand firmly. The knowledge is ancient, Jacob said. I did not invent it. I only remembered what my father taught me. And stone never forgets. Outside, the polar sky grew dark as night fell over the Wisconsin wilderness. The mercury would drop to 34 degrees below zero. Before midnight, the absolute coldest night recorded in the region in over 50 years. In cabins across the county, it would be a night of bitter suffering, shivering, and desperation. But inside one tiny, perfectly engineered timber shelter, Jacob Vinter slept in absolute comfort, enveloped in a gentle, radiant warmth generated by 3,200 pounds of river granite that held fire in its memory and released it like a quiet breath into the winter night. The mad design had officially become a blueprint for wilderness survival. Spring arrived late to northern Wisconsin in 1892. When the ice on the rivers finally broke and melted during the first week of April, the timber camp conducted its annual end-of-winter audit. They evaluated equipment losses, timber yield, structural damage from snow loads, and human casualties. The winter had taken a heavy toll on the settlement. 2 families had abandoned their claims in February, fleeing south to Milwaukee after burning through their entire winter wood supply before mid-January. One elderly logger had died of severe pneumonia, complicated by cold exposure, after getting disoriented during a blizzard while trying to reach his woodpile. 3 traditional log cabins had suffered devastating chimney fires caused by desperate overstoking. One had burned completely to its foundation, leaving a family homeless in sub-zero weather. Jacob Vinter's cabin stood completely untouched. Its timber structure was sound, its occupant was in perfect health, and his dry wood pile was still more than half full. The real story of that winter was not merely that Jacob had survived in comfort, it was how his knowledge had spread through the territory like a protective shield. By late February, while deep snow still buried the wilderness trails, 4 new compact cabins stood completed throughout the timber claim. Small, compact, stone-heavy structures, they drew openly from Jacob's original blueprint. Thomas Bradley supervised the construction of 2 cabins, while Friedrich, the German builder, directed the others. The Halverson family moved into the first completed cabin on February 28th. They had 3 young children, under 7 years of age. They had spent January and early February huddled in a freezing, drafty 20 by 20 foot cabin, burning fence posts and furniture to supplement their depleted wood pile. Their children had developed persistent, deep coughs that had driven their mother to absolute desperation. The new Halverson cabin measured 14 feet by 16 feet, slightly larger than Jacob's original home. The continuous stone foundation contained an estimated 4,000 pounds of river granite and dense limestone. The double log walls utilized timber salvaged from an abandoned claim. The ceiling was set at precisely 6 feet 8 inches, and the hearth was built in an interior corner with an interior stepped stone chimney stack surrounded by thermal mass. Within 2 days of moving in, the children's coughs began to show dramatic improvement. Within a week, the entire family was sleeping comfortably through 8 hours of dark night on a single bedtime burn that lasted 3 hours before dying out. Mrs. Halverson, who had been deeply skeptical of the Norwegian design until sheer desperation forced her acceptance, told everyone in camp that moving into the compact stone cabin was like stepping into a completely different world. The second family cabin, completed in mid-March for the Kowalski family, produced identical results. Warm earthen floors, minimal firewood consumption, and interior air temperatures that remained stable and warm even when the fires went out overnight. It was not just local families who took notice. Trappers, hunters, and woodsmen who lived alone or in pairs in the deep wilderness far from the timber camps began appearing at Jacob's door with questions. How deep should the granite foundation go? What was the ideal ratio of stone mass to room volume? Could you adapt the design for a 16 by 16-foot shelter, or did the thermal efficiency break down at larger sizes? Jacob answered every inquiry with patient, humble precision. He sketched structural diagrams directly in the damp clay floor using a sharpened stick. He explained heat storage calculations using simple language and hand gestures when his English failed him. He never claimed personal credit for the design. He never suggested that he was an innovator or a genius. The knowledge is very old. Jacob would tell every visitor who came to his door. It comes from Norway, from Germany, from Russia. Every country with killing cold knows this secret. America simply forgot it, or never learned it. I only remembered what was already written in stone. By the time the spring thaw was complete, 23 trappers and wilderness hunters within a 50-mile radius had built or planned variations of Jacob's thermal mass cabin. The timber company itself commissioned 3 additional compact cabins for the following winter, preparing for new workers who would require efficient, survivable housing. The designs evolved as different builders added their own practical refinements. Some incorporated raised sleeping benches, built directly over extended stone foundation platforms, creating beds that stayed warm all night long. Others experimented with soapstone instead of granite, discovering that soapstone held thermal energy even longer. A few builders added interior stone accent walls that doubled as giant radiant radiators. Yet every single variation shared the exact core principles Jacob had introduced: high-density thermal mass, compact air volume, double-wall convective isolation, and short, high-intensity burns. Thomas Bradley, who had once declared the original design insane, became its most enthusiastic champion. In April, Bradley dismantled his old drafty cabin and built a new compact home measuring 15 feet by 15 feet, incorporating nearly 3 tons of granite in its foundation. When autumn arrived, and the first autumn frosts returned in October, Bradley recorded his performance figures meticulously. When the outside temperature dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, his interior room remained at 47 degrees above zero without a fire burning. His firewood consumption dropped to 1/3 of his previous usage, and his earthen floor retained comfortable heat for 14 hours after his evening fire died. Bradley sent his detailed measurements, along with precise structural sketches of Jacob's design, to a building and engineering journal in Chicago. The journal published his report in their November 1892 edition under the headline, "Frontier Thermal Mass Construction: Norwegian Techniques Prove Superior in Wisconsin Trials." The article credited Jacob Vinter by name. It sparked widespread interest among frontiersmen, engineers, and homesteaders who understood that heating efficiency was not merely a matter of convenience, it was a matter of human survival, resource management, and intelligent design. In December 1892, almost exactly 1 year after Jacob had moved into his small shelter, the timber camp held its annual winter gathering. Families and workers gathered in the mess hall to share a communal feast before the deep winter cold set in. During the dinner, Larson, the camp boss, stood up and raised his cup in a toast. "To Jacob Vinter," Larson announced, his voice carrying across the crowded hall. "The man who proved to all of us that the old ways are not backward. They are just older, and sometimes being older means being wiser." The assembled woodsmen, families, and builders raised their cups and cheered. Jacob, uncomfortable with public attention, smiled quietly and nodded from his seat near the back of the room. Later that evening, as the gathering broke up and people stepped out into the crisp December night, a young logger named Samuel approached Jacob. Samuel had lost his father to cold exposure during the previous winter. He had planned to abandon northern Wisconsin forever, fleeing south to escape a climate that felt like a death sentence. Instead, Samuel had spent his autumn building one of the new compact stone cabins. "I wanted to thank you," Samuel said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "If my father had known last winter what we all know now." Jacob placed a warm, calloused hand on the young man's shoulder. "The knowledge was always here," Jacob said gently. "It was in the stone, it was in the fire. We only had to remember how to open our eyes and see it." "How did you trust it when everyone said you were wrong?" Samuel asked. "When everyone called you crazy?" Jacob smiled a quiet, knowing expression. "In Norway, we have an old saying, 'Den som ler sist, ler best.' He who laughs last, laughs best. I did not need to laugh at them. The stone laughed for me. Every warm night, every morning with heat still in the floor, that was the stone's laughter." Jacob Vinter's original cabin stood in that Wisconsin clearing for 47 years. It was finally dismantled in 1939, when the last timber claims were retired and the surrounding wilderness began reclaiming the land. Before it was taken apart, structural engineering teams from 3 major universities visited the site to document its construction and measure its thermal properties. After nearly half a century of harsh Midwestern winters, the river granite foundation remained perfectly level and crack-free. The double log walls showed virtually no decay, and the interior stone chimney stack remained as sound and efficient as the day Jacob laid the last row of clay mortar. Educational note: this presentation contains historical survival narratives and traditional building techniques intended for educational, historical, and storytelling purposes only. Modern construction projects must always comply with local building codes, professional structural engineering standards, and modern fire safety guidelines. Never attempt structural masonry or unvented heating without consulting qualified structural professionals. Jacob Vinter's cabin proved a fundamental truth that transcends time, technology, and geography. Dismissing ancient wisdom as primitive often reveals our own ignorance rather than the flaws of the past. Solutions forged through generations of harsh experience carry a quiet brilliance that modern convenience can easily make us forget. Sometimes, the most revolutionary step forward is simply taking the time to remember the wisdom left behind.